Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this piece on Gregory Bateson in the American Journal of Semiotics, and this was edited by Deborah Eicher-Kat, and it was a special issue on Gregory Bateson. And I want to talk a little bit about Bateson's work on play and fantasy, and maybe help set up a context so that the next video here on the knot and paradox maybe can make a little bit more sense. What happened was Gregory Bateson was in the Flesh Hacker Zoo, and he went there knowing, or at least presuming, that he would find no evidence for anything like denotative utterance in the animal world. Now, by denotative utterance, I mean the ability to give an utterance that bears propositional content of which we can ask, is that true or is that false? There's lots of utterances that people give that aren't really denotative utterances. There can be utterances like look out, or come here, or eek, or what's that? These are all different genres of utterance, but there's a particular genre which is denotative proposition. I say, this is a book, or if I say that is a mammal, right? These are statements about the world that are deemed to be true or false. Now, what happened was, it's important to suggest that in order to give a denotative proposition, we do have to have some notion of truth conditions, and it does have to have some relation of what we mean by an object. We have to have some sort of classification system and some sort of category systems in order to say whether or not something is or is not a member of that category. Okay, Bateson was at the zoo, and he watched two monkeys playing with one another, and he saw one monkey nip the other monkey. Now, what happened was, as the monkey was nipping the other, Bateson thought to himself, the nip means the bite, but it doesn't mean what a bite would mean. Yeah, the nip means the bite, but doesn't mean what a bite would mean. And that revolutionized his thought. Bateson recognized that in the animal kingdom, even though they don't yet have what we would recognize as denotative utterances, they have at least, mammals, to the extent that they're able to play, have at least the rudimentary beginning, what he later would formulate as the onion skin, but the sort of rudimentary beginning of layers of abstraction, or of multiple logical types, or of frames within frames as part of their discourse. So try to think about it this way. If you think of a person, and I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is that this capacity to develop logical types or categories or classes within classes, this is vital to language, not only because it helps us to uh, give propositional content, and to say truthful statements, but it's also because we can confuse those logical types, that we're able to live in a world of humor and play and jest, right? I mean, if I say a guy walks into a bar and then he says, dang, I got to move that bar, that's the third time I hit that today, there's something funny going on. It's because we can confuse logical types of words. Right? I say the yogi comes down from high on the mountaintop, and he goes down into the center of New York City, and he walks right up to a hot dog vendor, and he gives him a $10 bill, and he says, "Make me one with everything." Then the vendor gussies up the dog, and he gives it back to him, and the yogi says, "Hey, what about my change?" And the vendor says, "True change comes from within." Now, we get these as jokes, and we can see these as funny because we're able to confuse logical types, because words can be at more than one level of abstraction simultaneously, or we can slide between the different levels of abstraction. That's what makes our life rich, right? Um, Maybe one way to clarify again what Bateson means when he suggests that the nip means the bite but doesn't mean what a bite would mean. Try to think about actors on a stage, right? You see two actors on a stage, and the one person gives a kiss to the other person. Now, if you're married or something like this, you're a partner to one of those actors, you might say, "Hey, what are you doing kissing that other person?" They would say, "Oh, no, no, I'm acting. This is just a staged kiss." The staged kiss means a kiss but doesn't mean what a kiss would mean. Somehow the fact that we can see a kiss, know that that's not a real kiss but is a staged kiss, this ability to differentiate frames within frames, this is part of what we mean by language. Take little children on the playground. So the children are on the playground, and they we say, okay, neither of these kids are cops or robbers, but this kid is the cop and this kid is the robber. That means this kid isn't a robber, he's a cop. This kid isn't the cop, he's the robber. So we differentiate between what is and what isn't, even though we know neither of those is true. There's multiple levels and there's multiple layers of the knot. Now, this issue of the knot is, again, a very vexing problem. It's the knot for Bateson is the evolutionary precursor to the development of logical typing, which then we slide around in and we sort of confuse ourselves between them. It's what he says, it's part of the process by which we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, right? I mean, this is the expression that Bateson actually uses. Now, I guess I would just maybe leave the discussion here and suggest to people, if they want to see more about what Bateson's talking about here, to look at this video on knot and paradoxes and try to think about the way that even though we are right to be admonished by the logicians to be very careful over our use of knot, and we do want to be very careful not to confuse logical types the best that we can, we also want to see that this is a kind of impossible ideal, that humans, because we are naturally falling into a primary process, we naturally fall into a kind of pre-reflective background practices, and fortunately so. It's because of our ability to confuse logical types that we can have play and fantasy, and we can kid each other, and we can tell jokes. Right? I can say something like 2 eggs and 2 pieces of bacon walked into a bar, and a bartender says, "Hey, we don't serve breakfast here." Okay, thanks.